Good evening, viewers, listeners, and good evening, Benji. This evening we are bringing you a pre-recorded program, so we don't have a facility for you to phone in, but do leave your comments still in the comment box, and we'll get back to them next week. This is a conversation between myself, Jenny Fisher, editor of East London News, and Jack, who has been with us before, Jack Halinski-Kirkpatrick. Jack is a writer for the socialist newspaper Socialist Appeal, I believe. And from that perspective, we're going to be looking at the situation in Ukraine. So stay with us for a conversation on Ukraine, the causes, and what we can do about what I hope we all agree is a dreadful situation. We'll tackle a lot of different angles as we go through this. So, good evening, Jack. Nice to see you. Although
good evening.
Not so nice to have to talk about this. I think last time we spoke, you were telling me that there wasn't going to be an invasion. So what happened? How did all that change? What do you think?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jenny, and thanks very much for having me. Yeah, no, it is true. I think last time we spoke, I did not think that an invasion would take place. And I think when you make a mistake, you should investigate why that was the case. And I think the reason why I thought there would be no invasion was that I thought that the US, that Western imperialism basically would make some concessions to Russia. I thought that you've had this general encroachment over the past 20, 30 years of NATO, of Western imperialism towards Russia. And I thought that, you could have some sort of deal being carried out with Ukraine becoming a kind of neutral country. And there were whispers of this. So you had Macron, for example, the president of France, who was talking about the Finlandization of Ukraine, i.e. make it a country similar to Finland, neither in the camp of Western imperialism nor in the camp of Russia. And so, you also had the Ukrainian ambassador to London was on the television, I think on Channel 4 News, also saying that Ukraine would be willing to give up its membership of NATO as well, which is, it's so in the Ukrainian constitution, it has a kind of desire to join NATO in it, basically. And he was hinting at the idea that they would be willing to give this up. So, yeah, I thought that some concessions would be carried out basically by the Western imperialists. But in the end, I think what kind of held through was that you had the US really was so keen on not having more damage being done to the reputation of US imperialism on a world stage. They've just been defeated in Afghanistan, had to withdraw in a chaotic manner from Afghanistan, and they thought they couldn't make any more concessions now to Russia because they'd be damaged on the world stage. They've got China to worry about as well. But whilst they were not willing to make any concessions, I will finish. I don't want to speak forever, but they were also not willing to commit any troops to Ukraine. And so those two factors combined, I think, in the end, made it inevitable. If Putin was not able to get what he wanted just by making threats, then he had to follow through on his threats, basically.
Well, as I think I've said to you before, I'm no expert on Ukraine or the politics of Europe, but the Ukraine's desire to join NATO and the EU, we might as well say here, that's came relatively recently, didn't it? I mean, it's not been a long-standing demand. Even I think since the breakup of the Soviet Union, it actually post-dated that when Ukraine sort of set up its own settlement, and originally it was very much pro-Soviet, and then there were protests, which led to the election of the current president, and the protests were for the country to look to the west rather than the east. So perhaps, do you think we should actually go back to that and look at how it was that Ukraine dealt with its independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and how that change came about? Have you any insight into that you can offer us?
Yes. Well, so Ukraine has, for a long time, it's kind of been a bit of a battle between different imperialisms in order to try and drag Ukraine into, their sphere of influence. I think what we see here is a battle between US imperialism on the one hand and a much smaller, much weaker imperialism in Russia on the other hand. And I think that you've had, for example, I think you mentioned maybe, the big protest movement in 2014, the Euromaidan movement, where this was a movement really which was aided and funded basically by the US. I think they spent $5 billion from Ukraine's kind of so-called independence up until the Euromaidan movement. They spent $5 billion funding opposition parties, funding parties that were more aligned to the interests of US imperialism. And so, there's been an attempt basically by the US to draw Ukraine into the sphere of influence of the West. And then on the other hand, you have Russia. Now, Russia was in no position basically to oppose Western imperialism after the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was an absolute disaster for Russia. A collapse of GDP, collapse of life expectancy. And so that's in that situation, you had a lot of the countries of kind of Eastern Europe being slowly, one by one, dragged into the sphere of influence of Western imperialism. But around kind of 2008, sorry, it is a bit complicated, but with you had US imperialism basically in a crisis after wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the 2008 economic crisis. And so Russia's now kind of said, this far and no further. And so that's why you had, the war in Georgia, for example. There are some similarities. Russia invaded Georgia, smashed the army, tried to replace the government, or did replace the government with a more pro-Russian government. And so, it's a similar situation, I think, that you have in Ukraine, where there's a fight between these two imperialisms, and then, the Ukrainian working class, the Ukrainian people caught in the middle.
But is there? I mean, you mentioned there my least favourite year of the century, 2008. And 2008, we know, was actually the collapse of the global economy. It was rescued from the brink, but it was... And I've always thought that after 2008, there was disagreement between the capitalists as how to get out of the current crisis. Should they impose austerity, which a number of governments did, or should they borrow, given the then low interest rates, and try to keep up living standards and progress in that way? So I think that, for me, that economic lever is really important, because otherwise you're left with saying, oh, well, it's hatred, isn't it? Sort of like the West hates the East or vice versa. And really, I think it's countries struggling to survive economically, because only if you have the economic power do you then have the political power to hold on to other countries, and vice versa. You need the political power to keep your economy better than the next chap's, sort of thing. So for me, the economic causes are very important in terms of what you've reminded us, was a resettling of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a sort of realignment. But now you do say Georgia and 2008, it seems to make more sense, that people are fighting over Ukraine. I mean, I don't know if you think that the economic levers, you can disagree with me, that's all right. I don't know if you think that the economic levers were really important, or if it was more of a political choice.
Yeah, well, I think it is a really important point you make, because there's a lot of talk in the media at the moment that, this current war is being fought for just purely nationalism, or just purely because Putin has gone mad, or all these sorts of kind of ideas basically are being given as causes. And I think really we need to understand why our wars fought, and they are, for one of the big reasons is economic. One of the other big reasons are kind of geostrategic interests as well. So the example of what happened after 2014 is a very good example, in that, why did Russia annex Crimea? Well, they annexed Crimea because there's a very important port called Sevastopol in Crimea. Following the Euromaidan movement, you had the old government of Yanukovych, who was leaning in a pro-Russian direction, overthrown in a protest movement that was, supported by the US and replaced by a more pro-Western government. Well, Putin couldn't have this, port falling into the control of a Western leaning government. One thing I want to say though is as well, because there's a huge amount of kind of Russophobia and all this sort of thing going on, and an immense amount of hypocrisy in the media with how the war is being presented. I just want to ask all of the viewers basically to carry out a bit of a thought experiment, and let's think, how would the United States respond if you had a coup being carried out, or a mass protest movement taking place in Canada, which meant that Justin Trudeau's government was overthrown and replaced by a pro-Chinese government, and then China created a military alliance with Canada, with Brazil, with Colombia, with Mexico, all joining, and then thousands of nuclear weapons being installed all along the border of the United States that could hit US cities. I don't think that Joe Biden and the media would be saying, well, all of these countries are free to join whatever military alliance that they want to. No, I think Putin is trying to push back at what he sees as a hostile military alliance.
I think that's a very good experiment, a very good way to put it. I think even Donald Trump would have been a bit put out at that one, let alone Joe Biden. Although I think I do sort of want to come in and say, fear like that does not necessarily, we'll talk about this in a bit, justify war. So I think it's very good you've reminded us that there's a historical context, that if this comes out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, empires don't just collapse overnight and everything adopts a new normal. There's a whole process, isn't there, which establishes a new normal. But what I wanted to ask you just now was, and the political and the economic go hand in hand. That's the other thing that I think we can say, right, we've established that now. Why Ukraine? Why is it that Ukraine, what is it about Ukraine that's made it the subject of this sort of tug of love between the West and the East? Why does everybody want a bit of Ukraine?
Well, again, I think I mentioned this before. I don't think it's necessarily something particularly special about Ukraine, really. For example, Russia did invade Georgia in order to overthrow the government that was in power there and replace it with a more pro-Russian government. I think Russia has concern basically about its kind of sphere of influence, really. I think that is the main thing. And I think that other causes that are given, in any war that's ever waged, there are always reasons given by the combatants, basically, and it's always excuses that are given, really, to justify whatever intervention is being made. And I think that,
Well, let's move on from there. That's fair enough. Let's move on. was, okay, we've established Putin was worried about spheres of influence. He was probably also a bit upset that despite, the different ways out of the global economic crash of 2008, he hadn't really got an answer, had he? I mean, he was not in an equal position with the West in terms of the economy. Western countries were borrowing, were doing austerity. Their economies were maybe recovering a bit, but not sliding back further. And he probably hadn't found an economic answer either, as well as you say, the sort of spheres of influence. So was invasion justified?
No, absolutely not. I think for sure, I think some people in kind of justified opposition to Western imperialism perhaps, do certainly lean too far the other way. I think for sure socialists, left-wing people need to oppose this war. This is a reactionary war being waged, but we need to oppose it for our own reasons. We don't oppose it in the same way that Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson are opposing this war, because these people are completely hypocritical. Boris Johnson will call Putin or Biden will call Putin a war criminal, and then they'll be cozying up to Saudi Arabia the next day in order to try and secure more, greater supply of oil. No, this is completely hypocritical from the West, the way, the reasons they give for their opposition to this war. But why do we oppose it? And I think we need to oppose it because it's a reactionary war which will only divide the working class. It will push many Ukrainian working class people into the camp of reactionary Ukrainian nationalism, and it will push many other, both people in Ukraine and also people in Russia behind reactionary Russian nationalism. So it will only divide the working class in Ukraine, and it will only aid to driving people also behind their own ruling class. I saw that quite a bad representative of the ruling class, but Boris Johnson is one, and his popularity ratings have been going up since the war. So that, I think, is why we oppose it, because it is reactionary for our own reasons, basically.
I mean, you're basically sort of saying, in other words, the old thing about the Ukrainian and Russian working classes have more in common with each other than they do with the rulers of their own nation state, which is obviously fair enough. But I mean, call me a pacifist, but is military action not just plain wrong?
I think you need to always look in terms of what the military action is, really. I mean, if the working class, for example, were in power in Britain, and you had the, I think the US has made a habit, right, of fomenting coups and invading all sorts of different countries. I think that self-defense of a sort of workers' government would be justified, really.
So yeah, so if the US sent the cruise missiles over, we'd have to defend ourselves, and we might do that by popping up the odd anti-cruise missile defense. Okay, fair enough. But maybe I was wrong to say is war not always bad. But is it the case that when it comes to war, only defensive wars can be justified? Can offensive wars ever be justified? I mean, I just cannot. My line is to say, well, look, yes, Russia was under provocation. Doesn't justify what it's done about it.
No, of course. And, this is a reactionary war. Like, Putin has given some reasons for this intervention, right? Like he talks about the denazification of Ukraine, and he talks about protecting the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. So Ukraine is a divided country by ethnicity. There are many ethnic Russians, basically, living in the east of the country. And in the wake of the 2014, Euromaidan movement, you had these two republics in the Donbass that declared independence, basically. And the Ukrainian state was waging a civil war against the peoples in this region. And so Putin, Putin has no interests, no humanitarian interests whatsoever in waging this war. It is reactionary. But there is an element of truth in what he's saying, because countless numbers of civilians were killed by the Ukrainian state in this war. And also, what was the character of the Euromaidan movement? Well, it was dominated actually by neo-Nazi fascist groups, who would hold up kind of reactionary far-right nationalists like Stepan Bandera up on their banners. And it was actually the reactionary kind of character of the Euromaidan movement which provoked these, rebellions basically in the Donbass region. So there is an element of truth in what Putin's saying, although he is obviously using this in order to justify his own imperialist ambitions.
Inexcusable ones, yeah. Okay, so we're moving forward. We've got a situation which is complicated. We cannot deliver easy answers or easy analysis to people. Analysis has to be subtle and complex. But if we oppose the war, if we feel compassion for those people who are suffering, if we feel concerned about the overall ongoing effects of this war, we have to be able to do things. So if we can sort of move on to what we can do about it. I think, not everyone agrees with me, but I think that one of the things we have to do in any situation is be able to say what we think the government should do. We may not have started from the same place as the government, we may not be able to influence the government, but we should be able to say what the government's doing is right or wrong. So the UK government, in common with the US and pretty much the EU, has got its act in gear in terms of sanctions, and it's also saying it's not going to have a military response. Should we say that's okay, hunky-dory, let's move on, or should we be calling on them, well, to do something else, to get involved militarily, to increase, I think somebody's already suggested this morning, haven't they, is it Italy or not, move from just sanctions through to banning trade altogether. So what should we be asking the government to do between sanctions or military action, do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, on sanctions, I think we do need to be quite careful about this. As socialists, as left-wing people, we need to have our own position. And what will be the impact of sanctions? Well, sanctions, I do not believe that sanctions on their own are enough to stop this war from taking place. But what I think they will do is they will hit the Russian working class. They won't really be hitting the oligarchs, at all, really. I've heard reports actually coming from Russia of some socialists trying to pass a resolution in one of the big trade unions in Russia opposing the war, which is an incredibly brave thing to do, given, even using the phrase war, in even describing this situation as a war or an invasion can lead to up to 15 years in prison in the country. But in any case, this resolution there was an attempt to pass it, but some of the workers in this trade union were so angry and so hostile to Western imperialism that they were actually viewing these events as, giving a bloody nose, basically, to the United States and to Western imperialism as a whole. So what I think that should tell us is that sanctions, all that will do really is push people behind the government, behind Putin. It won't be seen as a kind of, a humanitarian approach, really. And then in war as well, to support military action, I think we need to ask ourselves again, what is the nature of the government? I think that foreign policy is always an extension of domestic policy. And if Boris Johnson has no interest in the working class in Britain, then why would he suddenly have humanitarian like beliefs as soon as he leaves the borders of Britain? And so I don't think we can have really any faith in our own government to be acting in a way that will ensure peace and an end to this war. And so what does that mean we can do? Well, I don't think really we should be. I think it's pointless, basically, to be trying to call on our government to do anything, really. It's an anti-worker government. It's perfectly happy to cozy up to all manner of dictators and human rights abusers, so long as those individuals are aligned to the interests of Western imperialism. So if we want an end to war, if we want to stop war, and I think what we need to do is we need to be understand where war comes from. And I think war in general is baked into the capitalist system. And so I think if you want an end to war, then you should get involved in the struggle to get rid of this system, to do away with it entirely, basically.
Yes, I can see what you mean on that. But on the other hand, we are here in the here and now. We are sat in our comfortable sitting rooms or wherever, watching mass genocide. Can I call it that? I mean, the military aggression from the Russia on the Ukrainian people. I mean, you can sort of explain it. It comes back to what I was saying about Putin's fears about being encircled don't justify, in my opinion, his actions. So when we see this, most of us have immense compassion with people who are sat in their basements with their children and the bombs are falling. Most people haven't experienced that. Most people in the UK today, I mean, they may have heard about it from Granny, but most people haven't experienced it all. Although, of course, if you think back even, when Tito died and the breakup of Yugoslavia, that it's not the first massacre, is it, in Europe since the Second World War. So most people will expect the government to do something. I don't think you support sending UK troops over to Ukraine to stop the Russian aggression. You rightly point out sanctions can affect Russian consumers, working people. So what should we be asking the government to do? Even if they're not listening, we should know what we want them to do.
I mean, one thing I would say as well is I think there is a concerted effort basically in the media to highlight so this is a war, right? Wars are horrible, bloody affairs where people die in wars. And I think that there is a concerted attempt basically to highlight every instance of death in order to drive people behind one side rather than another. And me saying this is not justifying the war whatsoever, but I do think we need to take one step back, really. I think the last figure I saw for civilian deaths from the United Nations was 500 or 600. Obviously, any person who dies in a war, it's a tragedy. But, to call this genocide and to call this, a war crime, I think, is a bit strange when you have people like George Bush, Obama, Donald Trump walking around free, and then there are never any questions whatsoever of them being described as war criminals or carrying out genocide. I think the official figures for the number of people killed by the United States alone between 2001 and 2021 was 71,000. So, it's, slightly more than what seems to have been the case at the moment. So it's not necessarily a question of numbers, I know, but why is this the case, right? Like, why is Putin being presented as an evil war criminal carrying out genocide when Saudi Arabia is not at all, when the United States are not at all? It's an attempt to make us support one side or another. My position, I think the position socialists should have, is that both of these sides are reactionary, and caught in the middle are the Ukrainian people. And so it is a bit of a difficult thing to say, really, because it seems like an easy answer to call on the government to up sanctions, or to call on the government to carry out military intervention. But, you know, where have sanctions ever worked? You know, the Cuban government have been in power for 60 odd years under the most harsh sanctions regime you can imagine from the United States. In Iran, the government is still in power there after, you know, there's all the talk about this sanctions regime that they're carrying out on Russia being like making Russia like Iran. But, you know, the Iranian government's still in power. So sanctions do not work. I don't think there is an easy answer for this, unfortunately. And so I think the only answer really is to join the struggle to get rid of this system, basically.
I wouldn't disagree with you on that one. It all needs thinking about, doesn't it? I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right in one sense. The number of Ukrainian deaths is not as large as the number of deaths in some other conflicts. But the number of injured, the number of people who feel attacked because they are being attacked, the number of people whose lives as they knew them 2 months ago have just been taken away, the numbers who have left Ukraine to avoid, voluntarily or otherwise, to avoid this fighting. I'm going to stick with calling it genocide. I'm afraid I think it's hit a lot of people. But I think, you know, I would give you. I think you're right about. At first, the news coverage sounds okay. This was hit. That was hit, and then it kind of gets a bit weird. Because, oh my God, this place has been hit and there's 4 people have died. And you think, oh, I thought maybe it would be 1,000 or so. Of course, in some places, I think it probably is. You know, all of us have to be horrified at the idea of people in a basement without heating, food, or water. And that point is pumped. We have to be horrified by that. And we're all, I mean, sometimes people say, oh, you know, you socialists, you know, you're without emotion, but we're not. As socialists, I think, are the most compassionate people rather than the sort of the warmongers and that. And we have to be horrified by reports on that. But at the same time, you know, it's like it becomes emotional then. And it's coming from people who don't have any answers either. I mean, look, I'm pushing you to come up with answers, say what the government should do. Government doesn't seem to know what it's going to do. There's a couple of things it's not going to do, but there's no real plan on how it's going to end, is there? So I'd like to, there's two more areas I think I'd like to cover. And one, maybe some of our viewers have been wondering why I haven't got here before, but because it is important. And that's Muslims. This is the note I've written down. So many other attacks, genocides, wars, taking people's lives away as they knew them, deprivation have gone on. And of course, it's all tied up with refugees as well. And there's been a lot of commentary here in East London about how Muslim refugees have never been as welcome as the sort of Aryan refugees, probably a provocative word, as the white refugees from Ukraine. So is this actually a compassionate response from the government? Come on, let's have refugees from Ukraine come in. Because it's in such contrast with Muslims. If you go and help the Ukraine conflict, you know, that's understood. If you go and help any other conflict elsewhere in the world, oh, well, you're a brown terrorist. I mean, have you had any thoughts about sort of anti-Muslim, this difference between how Ukraine is being treated and how sort of conflicts with Muslims have been treated.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, well, first of all, let's not give the government too much credit. They've been extremely slow in opening up to Ukrainian refugees. You know, if you compare the numbers of refugees from Ukraine coming to Britain compared to, say, Poland or Hungary or some of the other countries in Europe, it is very small. But no, I do. That's not to say I disagree with you. I completely agree with you. There's been a marked difference in terms of how refugees have been, considered. Really, I think one thing that can explain this as well is, why does kind of racism exist in society? And one of the big reasons, I think, is to divide working class people against each other. There were all these reports about entire industries basically being existed, making up lies and spreading horrific racist lies about Muslim people over the recent period. Big public relations companies basically that exist to make perhaps white working class people in Britain a bit suspicious, a bit hostile perhaps to immigrants. Why is this done? Not immigrants, but people of any different ethnic background. Why is this done? It's because as you said earlier, Jenny, working class people have much more in common with each other than they do with perhaps their white bosses. And if you live in a society that's as unequal and as unfair as we do today, then you need some way of dividing people to blame each other for their problems rather than the system as a whole. And you get the complete contrast to today, because now there is also a concerted attempt to whip up hostility towards and part of that attempt and Russia as a whole. There's an attempt to paint kind of Russia as this bogeyman, so that then people are more scared of a foreign power than concerned about their own day-to-day problems, which I don't think will last forever, but it has had a certain effect. And part of that is to manipulate the very real feelings of sympathy that people do have to the human suffering that they see in Ukraine.
Yes, it's I mean, I see what you mean about upping the idea of hostility to Putin, which is like for our audience. Although Putin's never actually done anything for his people either, really. Economically, most people who live in Russia are not having a great time since capitalism came into Russia. A lot of the vulnerable parts of the working class have been really shafted without that sort of socialist safety net, or at least sort of Stalinist type safety net. But there's a difference, isn't there, between Putin being disliked by his own people and, or rather Putin being vilified by the West, and then his record at home. And of course, there's not a great deal of public open debate, not a great deal of information in Russia, as there isn't in the UK, but certainly a lot of people. And I must throw in as well, not least, because it's always a good idea to mention Peter Tatchell, lesbian and gay rights in Russia have not been the best. So there's a lot to criticise Putin for. And I think it's actually fascinating to see, you referred earlier to these, to various little tiny signs, green shoots of opposition in Russia, the ones we've seen about, the television protests, but also what some of the soldiers have said and what some of the, if you're telling us about some trade union action as well, that can only be a good sign in terms of the rapprochement between the working classes of the two areas. So yes, I think we do have to bring out what hypocrisy it is, to have a boat full of people coming across the channel and saying, behold, you half a dozen, 2 dozen people. If we let you in, you will destroy the English way of life. And a very different response in Ukraine, although, again, we should do it. I'm all for, unashamedly for, taking people out of war zones. You know, if you're going to get killed, then you know, I'll work for you to get to safety, whoever you are. But yeah, we're seeing it, looking at it in a sort of bigger political context here. Okay, the last point, I think, we've been speaking about what we should be telling or asking our government to do. Difficult an exercise though that is. What about us, the ordinary people, the little people? What surprised me is, you know, there's sort of this national coverage. Oh, you know, take in a refugee, whatever. Have a bake sale for Ukraine. That'll make us all feel better. And it's all part of the same sort of approach as the government, really. Why has no, or maybe I've missed it, has no left-wing, socialist, trade union, workers, whatever, movement come forward and said, right, you know, we know where the Soviet embassy, or sorry, the Russian embassy is, which I presume we do. I don't, but I presume somebody does. Let's have a peace camp. That's what we used to do. We used to camp outside to, you know, bring the issue home, or come up with some other protest action. So what can we do? I know you want to end capitalism and bring about socialism, but is there anything we can do that might happen even sooner?
Yeah, well, I think that people who are, you know, more interested, are following the news and want to, you know, help out. I think what we can do really is to spread the word, essentially, as to what is actually taking place. You know, I think there's been a couple of instances of this. I remember the socialist campaign group of Labour MPs at some point, you know, just as the war kind of began, had signed up to a sort of stop the war coalition statement, which I think had some weaknesses, but one thing that was good about it was that it did point out the role of NATO as well. You know, as it being two sides in the conflict, not just the kind of one-sided assault from Putin. Now, unfortunately, it was a real shame, because what you've seen in the Labour Party is Keir Starmer, you know, wanting to appear statesmanlike and, you know, acceptable to the capitalist class, has basically used this situation, like he's done with, you know, the whole time he's been leader, basically, as an excuse to attack the left. And so he essentially threatened all of these MPs with losing the whip. And it was really unfortunate that these MPs then, within about 30 minutes of being threatened with this, then withdrew their, you know, withdrew their signatures from this statement. And it's notable, actually, also that you have a similar process taking place in Russia. There were several kind of Communist Party MPs and local branches that were passing anti-war resolutions, but you had the leadership of the Communist Party then threatening them also with expulsion. So you see a similar process. But what I think this shows is that we, you know, as socialists, as left-wingers, what we need to do is to play a role in opening people's eyes, basically, to the criminal role that our own leaders, our own ruling class, have had, because we can use this we can use this in order to expose their role, basically, that they have in provoking war, because, you know, the West is, you know, is partly responsible for all of this taking place, basically. And it's needed, sorry, I will finish on this, it's needed now more than ever, given the extreme kind of, you know, mood of national chauvinism that's being whipped up by the media and by all, you know, sides of the establishment.
Yes. On another day, I would have gone on to ask you, how are we going to respond to sort of, you know, working people in the UK when the government that we think might be doing the right thing internationally messes up the British economy. I mean, when inflation bites, when the cost of we've got a cost of living crisis. Well, the effects of that are going to be felt in the UK, and then will that help? It's a fascinating discussion for how people are going to deal with the government. I think everyone who thought that life was like a normal life, and we didn't in the UK have to think about politics or life, it's going to have a rude awakening. We are going to have to make choices and take action if we want to influence the outcome of how we live our lives and how we help or hinder other people to live their lives as well. So it's come to something when, like the boat people, Jeremy Corbyn can't even be let into the Labour Party just in case he makes it look a bit responsive and not quite elite enough. So there we are. I think we should draw this to a close now, Jack. It's been good talking to you, and I hope the viewers have, been able to engage and to listen. It is controversial because people will always have different ideas, but it's been good to raise these issues, and hopefully, you can come on again in a couple of weeks and talk to us again about how things are developing, and certainly if there are any developments. But again, we have to say we are not in favour of the obliteration of any people of any country in the world. So let's gird our loins and think of something we can all do about it. Oh, and if people want more information, I think Stop the War Coalition has had a couple of rallies, and on the Stop the War Coalition website, I think there are videos of those rallies, and you can hear an even bigger range of speakers talking about the Ukraine war than you have heard this evening. So, Jack, I won't wish on too long. Thank you very much for coming on, and I'm afraid we may need to see you soon.
Thanks very much for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Benji, time to go to bed now. And the other viewers, thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week. Good night.